Now invite Mr. Anram Narsimhan, Managing Director, Merck Specialties Private Limited, to introduce and welcome our keynote speaker. A very warm welcome and over to you.
Thank you, Kathy, and a very good evening to all the colleagues and folks from the industry and from outside who are on this online virtual exciting session that we have been having over the last 2 days. We are almost in the last leg of the session, and I have the honor of introducing today for a very interesting topic on accelerating biopharma R&D journey in India, Professor K. VijayRaghavan. Professor K. VijayRaghavan is the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, succeeding Dr. R. Chidambaram in April 2018, and the Chairperson of Prime Minister's Science, Technology and Innovation Advisory Council, the PMSTIAC. He was Secretary, Department of Biotechnology, Government of India from January 2013 to February 2018. The Principal Scientific Advisor works with all arms of the government, with our states, our citizens, national and international agencies. The goal is that the benefits of science, technology, and innovation solutions reach the most needy for the most suitable development of India and for the well-being of our planet. Professor VijayRaghavan is also a distinguished professor at the National Center of Biological Sciences, NCBS, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Bangalore, TIFR, and was the NCBS director till 2013. He studied chemical engineering at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, and holds a PhD in molecular biology from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and was a senior research fellow at the California Institute of Technology. His research is on nerves and muscles and how complex behavior emerges during animal development. Professor VijayRaghavan is a fellow of the Indian Science Academies, the Royal Society, the Academy of Medical Sciences, UK, and a foreign associate of the US National Academy of Sciences. He was awarded the Padma Shri by the Government of India in 2013. I would now like to invite Professor VijayRaghavan to share with us his thoughts on this exciting topic on accelerating biopharma research and development, its journey in India. Over to you, Professor VijayRaghavan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anram. This is a great honor to be here. And I heard a little bit of the previous panel discussions, and you've covered a lot of very important and exciting topics. The real issue which we have ahead of us is how we have learned from the pandemic and what that means for us going ahead. Now, if you were to have had this meeting in 2019, you would have got a certain and very different overview of where we are headed. Most of those would have talked about how our current situations can be scaled up, how access can be given to different people, how that matches with the different companies, their stakeholders and shareholders, and so on and so forth. Business as usual, in other words, and nudging each other to get ahead. Today, the pandemic has resulted in us having to completely relook at the way we address these kinds of bio-pharma issues and pharma issues. How have things changed and what has really changed? That's something which I will very briefly try to address. Now, of course, we have many aspects which are sort of boilerplate points which are important and need to be covered. The pharma sector is growing. The sector is contributing as it did to health outcomes and growth. India is a major vaccine provider and a drug provider, and so on and so forth. But what has really changed because of the pandemic? Now, keep in mind, number one, that the pandemic was predicted. The fact that coronaviruses could cause pandemics, that MERS and other viruses could cause pandemics, there could be other kinds of viruses which could cause pandemics. All of that has been flagged relatively often by major international and national organizations over the last decade at least. Now, the problem is that these forebodings of potential dangers are very difficult to take into action in societies where there are multiple other demands. Whether you're a developed society or a developing society or a society where there's a greater likelihood for pandemics to arise, the conflicting demands which we have means that it's not easy for us to invest in pandemic prevention and public health on a scale which is required. Because the challenge is that the kind of investment which we need, their returns really come in a preventive manner and therefore are not easy to see. Once you have a crisis, everyone comes on board immediately to squelch the crisis and recover. And then there's a huge amount of investment, science going into it, and analysis going into that. Again, once the crisis is over, there's a danger. This is something we must avoid in going back to business as usual. We cannot go back to business as usual. So what has the pandemic taught us? Now, there are three different components of the pandemic which are important, which I'll try to address, and why it's important. All these three aspects are important for the biopharma industry going forward. These three aspects are public health, as well as the access to care at different levels, primary, secondary, tertiary. The second is the situation which comes from vaccine development. And the third relates to more broadly drug development as well as biologics and their development. Now, first of all, the issue of public health infrastructure and access to different kinds of layers. There it is absolutely clear that there are societies which have invested huge amounts in public health, others less so, some which are well organized, others less so. But the issue is not so much about how much one invests alone and how well those structures seem to be, but are those structures resilient to surges and do they have surge capacity? Well, this is a big problem because surge capacity means really being able to handle situations, not just 10, 20, 30% more capacity than what one has, but several fold capacity. No society can deal with that on a short time period when it has that kind of surge capacity at its door. And therefore, we must, in public health, have systems which allow the lateral movement of capacity from other kinds of sectors into the public health sector speedily when surge capacity of this kind is required. The second related point is that, while we, it's point 1b actually, while we actually have had extraordinary responses to the pandemic, it takes time for vaccine development and drug development. And in some cases, we may not luck out. With the SARS-CoV-2, the vaccines work, even though they've had a tough haul with new variants. There could be other pandemics where the vaccines may not be able to work that well or don't work at all, or vaccine development is not possible. And therefore, non-pharmaceutical interventions, non-pharmacological interventions, such as respirators and masks need to be available on scale. So, filters and portable respirators could be the first line of defense, particularly for healthcare workers. This needs to be developed and deployed on scale if you are to have a response which protects healthcare workers no matter what the respiratory is. So I think the deployment of both available pharmacological interventions where feasible and the development of non-pharmacological interventions and deploying them on scale needs to be something of a routine aspect going ahead. Part 1C of the public health preparation is our hospital and public health, primary health infrastructure. Again, the kinds of requirements which are there, whether they are beds or ventilators or oxygen equipment or drugs, PPE, nursing staff, doctor staff, all of that needs to be able to move from location to location very rapidly. And that might need structural and process tweaks also so that doctors, nurses can move rapidly. That's something also we need to be prepared for. In this part, what we need to keep in mind is while we develop capacity, we need to develop resilience and speedy response mechanisms so that we are not caught unawares. And this is something which we have learned and which we will actually need to implement all over the world going forward. The second aspect relates to vaccine development. And here specifically, the challenge comes about the regulatory processes on one side, and secondly, the side regarding is it worthwhile for companies to prepare vaccines against diseases which have not yet become epidemic or pandemic. And this is a quintessential challenge which we have between what is shareholder requirement and stakeholder requirement. Shareholder requirement requires you to make products which have a market. Stakeholders, by and large, require you to be able to deploy these products at very low or near zero cost in some cases, and do that on scale. But how do you get the resources to develop vaccines on scale and store them? So this needs to have a strategic global partnership initiative, and many organizations are pushing this so that we can not only develop vaccines, but we can also have them past phase 1, for example, preclinical and phase 1, so that should there be a need, a rapid scale up into other trials are feasible. We've had very rapid vaccine development during the pandemic, and that is amazing. Normally vaccine development would have cost 10 times more and taken 10 times longer. But this is a wake-up call for us to examine our regulatory processes in a manner which allow us to go ahead after the pandemic wanes, so that we have a situation where we can have speedy regulation without compromising quality. So regulation on a global scale needs to be revisited. How does one do that? Animal trials, preclinical trials, animal trials, first in human trials, all of that need to be pushed. And these need to be done in countries such as India on scale, in the countries of Africa, and in other places. The other point related to vaccine development and deployment is that how much can we have in terms of national requirements and global requirements? We have seen during the pandemic that the deployment of vaccines where they are most needed on scale did not happen as fast as they could have. Many big and rich countries hesitated in deploying vaccines until their own population was vaccinated. Very large countries like India also, when severely hit, had a great pressure to address their populations while also trying their best to meet international commitments. And therefore, we must have mechanisms again where the most needy have equitable access. And that's another global challenge which we need to go ahead. Now, going forward into drugs and biologics, in many ways, the best value for pandemics and actually for other diseases are drugs if they are effective and readily available. But drugs against viral diseases pose many challenges. Viruses use host machinery for their replication in a large way, and therefore drugs which hit the virus uniquely are very difficult. Also, if you don't hit the virus early and the virus has multiplied, then it's a big challenge for drugs to be effective. So drugs have a narrow window and a great challenge in being effective. But despite that, there are many notable examples of successes in the drug industry. These need to be explored very rapidly again, just as we have buffered vaccine development. We need to have buffered drug development through animal studies, as also first in human studies. That needs to go forward. Biologics are going to be a very powerful weapon, not just for pandemics, but otherwise also. And their development, not just from biosimilars, but from original development of biologics, need to have a much broader research base than we have right now. In general, the large investments which pharma companies have made and biotech companies have made have resulted in quality products on an enormous scale. This has the flip side that going forward, there's going to be more and more difficulty in finding effective new products very easily. So it's not just the investment you're willing to put in, it's also how you can deploy that investment in a manner where it's most effective. There, our efforts must concentrate on broadening investment in the ecosystem so that drug discovery, both through initial computational methods and later on through other methods, direct experimental methods, is done widely in a way so that there are multiple approaches, multiple candidates coming up from our startup ecosystem, from our academic ecosystem, and from our research institutions. In this manner, the core investment by pharma companies in their R&D can be amplified into a broader portfolio going ahead. So that's very important. Lastly, all of this requires speedy diagnosis and testing. That's something which we need to scale up again in a manner which we've learned well from the pandemic. And those kinds of testing and diagnostic methods need to feed back into what effectively will be a new age of personalized medicine. The testing data will be digitally taken up into the cloud, and that will allow both from genomic, environmental, and testing information to see what is the best treatment possible for the patient. The patient will be able to consult both locally and in hubs very far away, and this has to be a rapid process. So telemedicine will not replace in-person medicine, but will be an important component, as will be telediagnostics of various kinds. And this will reduce the load on major tertiary hospitals where people tend to gravitate because such alternatives are not available to scale. All this taken together holds a great promise for the way we can go ahead in our new development of drugs and pharmaceuticals, but it also requires great courage on our parts from our investigators, from our research institutions, and from the companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, Professor VijayRaghavan.